Minister may step down after employee's death. Minister of Labor Ho Pei-shan said she would tender her resignation following criticism of her handling of alleged bullying by Ministry of Labor Workforce Development Agency Branch Director Si Young, resulting in the death of an employee. The ministry yesterday gave Si 2 demerits and said she is subject to review by the disciplinary court. The severest possible punishment would be her removal from office and being barred from government jobs indefinitely. Workforce Development Agency Director General Tsai Mengliang also received a major demerit and was transferred to another position. Premier Cho Young-tai issued a formal apology and ordered the ministry to hand the case to prosecutors for further investigation. Cho also asked all government agencies to review internal regulations regarding workplace bullying and, if necessary, amend their rules to enhance employee protection and expedite investigation. An employee surnamed Wu was on November 4 found dead at the Executive Yuan Xinjiang co-working office building, with preliminary investigations indicating that the cause of death was suicide, which allegedly happened after Xi's bullying. Ho faced criticism and questions from lawmakers in a meeting of the legislature's Social Welfare and Environmental Hygiene Committee over the ministry's handling of the bullying case. Asked whether her comments on being willing to take political responsibility meant that she was stepping down, Ho replied in the affirmative. Committee convener Su Qingchuan approved a Chinese Nationalist Party caucus proposal to forward the case to the Control Yuan and the disciplinary court, and bring in a third party for the investigation. KMT legislator Chen Qinghui alleged on Facebook that Ho Pei-shan had called DPP Deputy Secretary General Ho Puwen, asking him to rein in Democratic Progressive Party New Taipei City Councilor Li Yuxiang, who blew the whistle on the incident. Chen alleged that Li had worked at the Workforce Development Agency's Northern Branch and therefore wanted to bring the case to light. In a post on Facebook, Ho Puwen said he had spoken with Ho Pei-shan on November 1, and she called to ask him to pass on the message that the Ministry of Labor would be launching an investigation involving third-party organizations, and to say that she hoped to establish a direct channel between her staff and Li. Ho Pei-shan made the call because she was not familiar with Li, he said, adding that he had forwarded the messages to Li and told him to do what you need to do. Add Taiwan to NATO Plus. Report support. Arms sales to NATO Plus countries such as Japan, South Korea, and Israel only have to be approved by the U.S. Congress if they exceed $25 million. The U.S. should amend a law to add Taiwan to the list of NATO Plus allies and streamline future arms sales, a U.S. commission said on Tuesday in its annual report to the U.S. Congress. The recommendation was made in the annual report by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which contained chapters on U.S.-China economic and trade ties, security relations, and Taiwan and Hong Kong. In the chapter on Taiwan, the Commission urged the U.S. Congress to amend the Arms Export Control Act of 1976 to include Taiwan on the list of NATO Plus recipients, referring to a designation held by South Korea, Japan, Australia, Israel, and New Zealand. Under the Arms Export Control Act, arms sales to NATO Plus countries only have to be approved by Congress if they exceed $25 million. Arms sales to Taiwan require congressional approval if they surpass $14 million. At a congressional hearing, USCC member and former Pentagon official Randall Shriver said Taiwan's inclusion in NATO Plus would add it to the most elite category of security assistance partners and ease the process of export control review on potential transfers to Taiwan. The Commission also recommended that Congress create a Taiwan Allies Fund that would provide foreign assistance only to countries that have an official diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. Under the proposed program, no country could receive more than 15% of the appropriated funding each year. Countries that no longer have a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan would immediately be ineligible for this funding, the Commission said. In a section on Taiwan's implications for the U.S., the report said Taiwan remains a key flashpoint for conflict with China, particularly as Beijing intensifies pressure on Taipei, raising the risk of a miscalculation. It also argued that Taiwan faces complex decisions about resource allocation as it looks to simultaneously counter China's gray zone tactics and adopt equipment more appropriate for countering an invasion. While the U.S. can assist Taiwan in both areas, it also faces challenges in rapidly arming Taiwan because of defense manufacturing limitations and extended delivery timelines, it said. As a result, Taiwan is unlikely to be armed to a sufficient degree to deter or counter China from invading on its own, and so it will rely on the United States to provide for its deterrence as the PLA continues to approach its 2027 and mid-century modernization goals, the report said. Even if it can be deterred from outright invasion, China continues to build the capability to quarantine or blockade the island, which represents a unique challenge for U.S. and Taiwan leaders, it said. Although Taiwanese chipmaker Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Co. has invested in building production facilities in the U.S., Taiwan still remains by far the most dominant in advanced semiconductor production, the commission said. Any disruption to output on the nation would therefore have major ramifications for the global economy and, more importantly, U.S. national and economic security, the report said. The USCC was created by Congress in 2000 and is required to submit to the Congress an annual report on the national security implications of the bilateral trade and economic relationship between the United States and China, and to provide recommendations for legislative and administrative actions. Taiwan-US signed deals worth $10.69 billion new Taiwan dollars reminder. The National Audit Office said that it warned the Ministry of National Defense to make sure its projects are not behind schedule. Taiwan has signed 3 contracts with the U.S. worth $10.69 billion new Taiwan dollars to procure spare parts for its Air Force and Navy, the government said yesterday. According to a notice on the government e-procurement system, the deal to procure standard and non-standard aviation parts and accessories and ship parts and accessories was signed by the Ministry of National Defense's Defense Mission to the U.S. and the American Institute in Taiwan. The notice said the contracts are valid from the day they were signed until the second half of 2026. The equipment included in the purchase would be used by the Air Force and Navy at facilities in Pingtung, Kaohsiung, and Tainan, the notice said. In other news, the National Audit Office's report for the first half of the year showed that of the ministry's 238 projects planned for this year, 62 had not received funding and 49 funded projects had not yet reached 90% implementation. According to the office's report, the ministry projects had a total budget of 136.50 billion new Taiwan dollars and could allocate 7.33 billion new Taiwan dollars, or 5.38% of its budget, to 62 projects. The 49 projects funded that have not reached a 90% completion rate, which include the purchase of new tanks, were given 16.45 billion new Taiwan dollars, or 12.06% of the year's total, the report said. The ministry had 6 months to act on its budget, and little progress was made on projects waiting for funding and ongoing projects, the agency said. The agency said it had notified the ministry to make budget plans and review why budget implementation has been behind schedule. In response, the ministry said it planned to fund its projects in the second half of the year. The ministry said it had ordered its units to step up oversight and project management to realize a 90% completion rate. Through budget reallocation and project reviews, it aims to reduce the risk of projects falling behind schedule, the ministry said.
Washington to provide Ukraine with land mines. AFP, Washington and Kiev. The U.S. will soon provide Ukraine with anti-personnel land mines to shore up its defenses against Russian forces, a U.S. official said late on Tuesday. The decision comes as U.S. President Joe Biden works to boost Ukraine's war effort in the final 2 months of his administration, before Ukraine aid critic U.S. President-elect Donald Trump takes power in January. On Sunday, Biden gave Ukraine the green light to fire US-supplied long-range missiles into Russian territory for the first time. The U.S. official added that Washington has sought commitments from Ukraine to use the mines in its own territory and only in areas that are not populated to decrease the risk they pose to civilians. The mines are known as being non-persistent because they go inert after a set period of time when their battery power runs out. Trump has repeatedly promised to end the war quickly, but has not provided details of how he would do so. With Russia gaining ground and increasing talk of negotiations, Ukraine is wary of being at a disadvantage when it comes to hashing out a peace settlement. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Tuesday told U.S. television network Fox News that Ukraine will lose the war if the U.S. pulls its funding to Kiev. Meanwhile, Russia on Tuesday said that it would respond after Ukraine fired longer-range U.S. missiles at its territory for the first time, as Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a nuclear threat on the Ling day of the war. A senior official said that a strike on Russia's Bryansk region earlier on Tuesday was carried out by ATACMS supplied by the U.S. Speaking 10 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov said the attack showed Western countries wanted to escalate the conflict. "We will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we will react accordingly," Lavrov told a news conference at the G20 summit in Brazil. Putin signed a decree on Tuesday lowering the threshold for using nuclear weapons, a move that the White House, UK, and EU condemned as irresponsible. Taiwan blasts jailing of HK activists, freedom curtailed. The conviction of 45 democracy advocates proves the unworkability of Beijing's one country, two systems model, the presidential office said. Taiwan yesterday condemned China over the jailing of 45 Hong Kong activists, saying democracy is not a crime. The government strongly condemned the Chinese government's use of judicial measures and unfair procedures to suppress the political participation and freedom of speech of Hong Kong's pro-democracy activists, presidential office spokeswoman Goya Hui said in a statement. International condemnation of the jailings has been swift, with the US, Australia, and rights groups slamming the sentencing as evidence of the erosion of political freedoms in the territory since Beijing imposed a national security law in 2020. Yesterday's sentencing not only breaks the promises of 50 years unchanged and a high degree of autonomy, but also further proves the unworkability of one country, two systems, Kuo said, referencing the Wuling year transitionary governance model after the handover from the UK in 1997. "The people of Taiwan and Hong Kong share a common pursuit of freedom and democracy," she said. The Mainland Affairs Council urged the Hong Kong government to protect its citizens' rights, cease political oppression, and release detained democracy supporters. Multiple incidents over the past few years have dealt a blow to Hong Kong's international ratings on democracy and human rights, the council said. The Hong Kong government should protect its people's rights, freedom of speech, and the right to an unbiased judiciary process, it said. The Democratic Progressive Party also condemned the rulings, saying that the full-on persecution of Hong Kong's democracy supporters highlights the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian nature. The forced passage of Article 23 of Hong Kong's Basic Law and the National Security Law has destroyed Hong Kong's democracy and human rights, and exposed the sham of one country, two systems, it added. The Chinese Nationalist Party said it continues to support democracy and freedom, adding that the ruling was inconducive to rallying Hong Kongers' support for the CCP government. Nonviolent methods of expressing opinions are a norm of democratic society and should be a fundamental right of the people, the KMT said. The Taiwan People's Party said it adamantly opposes such repressive authoritarianism and urged the CCP to answer international concerns regarding its conduct. The TPP caucus in May urged the Mainland Affairs Council to flesh out ways for Hong Kongers to seek political asylum or pursue business immigration, it said, calling on the administration to support Hong Kong. Hong Kong Outlanders, a Hong Kong support group in Taiwan, panned the ruling as illogical and symbolized the death of the concepts of the rule of law and an independent judiciary in Hong Kong. The group urged the Taiwanese government to continue to support Hong Kong protesters and provide them with channels to conditionally seek asylum. It also called on the Taiwanese government to promote and guarantee Hong Kongers' basic rights in Taiwan, providing them a haven from cross-border threats from the CCP.
Ukraine's allies are inviting their own strategic defeat. The Joe Biden administration and others in NATO should do all they can to help Donald Trump change the battlefield dynamics so the next U.S. president can oversee a genuine peace. Last year, some Western leaders started boasting of Russia's strategic defeat in Ukraine. This was always a terrible idea and a line that Russian President Vladimir Putin never tires of citing as he pushes the false claim that he sent his armies across the border to defend Russia from Western aggression, rather than invade a former colony for gain. Now, after more than 1,000 days of bloodshed, we are finally beginning to see the outlines of such a strategic defeat emerge. But the potential losers are Ukraine and its allies, not Putin. I'm not trying here to blame U.S. President-elect Donald Trump in advance. Should Putin succeed in crushing Ukraine and achieving his war aims in the new year, the ill-judged, leverage-destroying rhetoric from some of the U.S. President-elect's family and advisors does not help and needs to stop. But the primary fault lies elsewhere. Some Republicans who back Trump's Peace Now approach say, often accurately, that they once supported a much stronger policy to back Kyiv than U.S. President Joe Biden's administration. They wanted the White House and U.S. allies in Europe to give Ukraine a wider range of military aid in bigger quantities and much faster. The war continues today, with Ukrainian forces struggling to hold the line, in large part because that did not happen in 2014 or 2022. Less truthfully, these same Republicans now say the only way forward is to explain to Ukrainians that time is up and they must accept whatever peace deal Putin is willing to offer on a schedule of Trump's choosing. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky agrees that the war should end next year. The dispute is over how. Kyiv, like its Baltic, British, Polish, and Scandinavian friends, understands that Putin has no incentive to negotiate anything and therefore would not. He has the advantage on the battlefield and sees Western resolve crumbling before his eyes. When Putin says peace, he means Ukraine surrender. There is only one answer to this conundrum that does not lead to strategic defeat for Ukraine and its NATO allies: a rapid change to align Ukrainian supplies and force regeneration with a new goal of achieving a lasting ceasefire that leaves Ukraine secure and independent. This has to be done with deliberation and in concert. Instead, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz on Friday last week became the first Western leader to call Putin in 2 years, without first making sure Kyiv and his country's allies were on the same page, and with no prospect of success. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan soon followed by leaking ideas for a peace plan he wants to mediate. Both men were jumping through the door Trump has opened by calling for a quick end to the war, and both did so for personal political gain. Scholz is on his way out of power, having called early elections. He is desperate for a miracle to reverse his political fortunes, and his uncoordinated, unplanned phone conversation with Putin was the result. Erdogan has seen himself as a mediator between Moscow and the West since the conflict started. He had striking success in negotiating a deal to keep grain flowing from Ukraine's blockaded ports early on, but less so when it came to the bigger picture. He has no intention of letting Trump, Scholz, or anyone else steal his thunder. As Zelensky said after the Scholz call, it risked opening a Pandora's box, and he was right. What is likely to emerge is a vanity parade of bids to lead on ending the war, which can benefit only Putin. The Kremlin swiftly dismissed as unacceptable Erdogan's plan to freeze the front lines, delay Ukraine's NATO membership bid for a decade, and deploy international peacekeepers to a demilitarized buffer zone. Ukraine and its supporters need to realign strategy with resources quickly. Kyiv's forces are fighting as hard and with as much determination as they ever were. Their ammunition supplies and advantage in drone warfare are in better shape than for much of the past year, but not enough to compensate for Russia's growing edge in personnel. Attrition, a mobilization Zelensky unwisely delayed, and a daring, yet ultimately failed gamble to reclaim the battlefield initiative by seizing Russian territory near Kursk have all contributed. Ukrainian forces are now ceding territory at a faster rate than at any time since the spring of 2022. None of this means Russia has overcome the manifold weaknesses that have cost it hundreds of thousands in dead and wounded, without, to date, achieving Putin's goal of returning Ukraine to Moscow's control. And yet Russia can sustain its losses for longer. It also now has allies willing to supply weapons and even troops to boost the war effort. The Biden administration is right to release as much aid as it can before shuffling off the stage. Also correct, if much too late, is the reported decision to authorize Ukraine's use of ATACMS tactical ballistic missiles against targets inside Russia. The restrictions have been imposed for fear of Russian escalation, but Putin, of course, escalated regardless. His deployments of North Korean troops and tactical ballistic missiles have already been confirmed. North Korea's Hwasong 11GA missiles have a maximum range of 900 kilometers and payload of 500 kilograms, compared with 300 kilometers and about 240 kilograms for the ATACMS. Ukraine's allies need to coordinate their efforts in front-loading supplies to Ukraine, instead of competing to win the peace. Leaders, including members of the incoming Trump administration, need to discipline their public and private messaging, so Putin is left in no doubt that refusing to negotiate with Zelensky, as opposed to simply demanding terms of surrender, would incur costs so high they could endanger his position at home. Taken alone, allowing Ukraine to use atoms inside Russia cannot do this. Nor can an extra $5 billion or more U.S. arms rush to the front over the next few months. Nor the Scandinavian initiative to fund Ukraine's expanding domestic arms production, from munitions to missiles. Nor even a timely, tactical withdrawal of troops from Kursk to bolster the front lines within Ukraine, or the better training and more efficient deployment of newly mobilized Ukrainian forces. However, executed together with a coherent new strategy, these moves have the potential to grind Russian territorial advances to a rapid halt and even reverse a few. That is hardly a utopian hope. The initiative in this war has shifted multiple times since it began. Ukraine's growing advantage in drone technologies, taken with stalemate on the ground and a growing long-range strike campaign against Russian troop concentrations, oil infrastructure, and airfields behind the lines, could yet persuade the Kremlin that time is no longer on its side. No matter how galling politically, the Biden administration and other NATO allies should be doing all they can to prepare for and, in reality, help Trump. They need to change the dynamics on the battlefield sufficiently that the next U.S. president is dealt the hand he needs to win a genuine peace. That would not represent the Kremlin's strategic defeat, because it was never going to, but it could force Putin to accept a ceasefire that leaves Ukraine independent and secures against further invasion. Tensions over China's overcapacity will rise under Trump, while U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's tariff threats are likely to dominate headlines in the near term. China's industrial overcapacity remains a larger, core challenge for the global economy and trading system in the coming years. With recently implemented tariffs by advanced and emerging economies and Chinese responses and macro stimulus, how this issue might evolve over the next few years is becoming clearer, with significant geopolitical implications. On October 29th, a month after U.S. tariffs targeting China's overcapacity went into effect, the European Commission imposed its own tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. While these actions attracted significant media attention, China's recent WTO complaint against Turkey's EV tariffs, a case underscoring China's failure to discourage major emerging markets from following the lead of developed economies, passed largely under the radar. At the same time, the surge in Chinese overseas manufacturing is reshaping the global economy and China's role within it. Beijing's latest stimulus plan demonstrates that despite the government's acknowledgement of weak domestic demand, macroeconomic rebalancing remains off the table. The policies driving China's overcapacity and the resulting trade tensions are probably here to stay. While the U.S.-China trade war might return to the fore with Trump's promise of 60% tariffs on imports from China, overcapacity there is ultimately likely to be felt more acutely in other major economies. Structural trends suggest that the EU could bear the brunt of a new China shock and ensuing trade tensions. As Europe's trade conflict with China escalates, the EU's EV tariffs, which faced resistance from some member states, might prove to be just the opening salvo. In response to these pressures, Chinese exporters have turned their attention to developing economies, which accounted for more than 50% of their exports last year. This trend is expected to persist, further widening China's trade deficits with major emerging markets. However, while these countries benefit from cheap Chinese goods and direct investment, they are also increasingly frustrated by limited access to China's markets, which jeopardizes their own industrial aspirations. New U.S. tariffs on China under Trump, who has also promised a 10 to 20% across-the-board tariff on all imports from other countries, will accelerate the shift of Chinese exports to emerging markets and the EU. This, in turn, would exacerbate these economies' concerns about Chinese non-market overcapacity and trade imbalances. Non-market overcapacity, although an imperfect term, captures three interconnected economic forces. First, China's industrial policies promote strategic sectors and push for import substitution, systematically reducing foreign imports across multiple industries. Second, persistent macroeconomic imbalances weaken domestic demand and drive China's massive trade surplus. Third, the global economy is dependent on Chinese supply chains, which heightens the risk of disruption and economic coercion. China's tightened export controls, particularly on critical raw materials whose supply it effectively controls, highlight the risks posed by this dependence. Some might argue that given the urgency of addressing climate change, overcapacity in key green industries is not necessarily a bad thing. Yet this argument would be far more compelling if China allowed fair competition in other sectors and did not threaten foreign access to vital clean energy inputs such as graphite. Through public messaging, multilateral engagement, and targeted tariffs, the US and the EU have prompted a necessary reckoning with China's industrial overcapacity, starting to address the problem before it wreaks havoc on industries and communities. Encouragingly, there are signs that Chinese firms have scaled back their expansion plans, owing to weak domestic demand and the growing difficulty of exporting excess capacity to international markets. While Chinese authorities have, as expected, largely denied the issue publicly, the external pressure has forced policymakers to take notice. That said, addressing the complex global challenges posed by China's overcapacity will require additional trade restrictions and innovative policy tools. The speed with which G7 countries reached a consensus on this issue signals more coordinated action ahead. As the EU, the US, Japan, and India tighten restrictions on Chinese goods routed through third countries, imports from China are likely to face increased scrutiny on national security, environmental, and labor grounds. Meanwhile, supply chain diversification, although still in its early stages, could create significant opportunities for developing economies elsewhere. China's primary response to these challenges has been increased foreign direct investment, largely welcomed by its trading partners. Some emerging market governments have even lowered duties on Chinese EV companies that establish manufacturing facilities within their borders, but there are growing doubts about the scalability and effectiveness of this approach. Chinese authorities are reportedly pressing for planned EV and battery investments in Europe to be curtailed. In Thailand, Chinese EV companies have faced criticism for not sourcing from local suppliers. More broadly, expecting Chinese firms to build large-scale manufacturing facilities in every major trading partner is unrealistic. And China's weak labor market might make the authorities more reluctant to allow manufacturing jobs to move overseas. Bloomberg in September reported that China had advised automakers to keep some EV technologies and production capabilities at home. China's recent policy shift towards stabilization measures to support the domestic economy and markets reflects a belated response to weak domestic demand and confidence. However, so far government efforts to stimulate consumption, essential for sustainable long-term growth, have been limited to increased funding for an appliance trade-in program and a reduction in mortgage interest rates. Stabilizing the property sector could boost household confidence, but the government has shown little willingness to allocate the necessary resources. Tackling China's overcapacity problem will require rebalancing the economy and overhauling industrial policies. Despite government-affiliated economists' growing discussion of innovative approaches, Chinese leaders remain opposed to essential reforms. As tariffs pile up and geopolitical tensions escalate, exacerbating China's economic slowdown, they might eventually be forced to confront these structural issues. Taiwan-Estonia ties are warming. Estonia is one of the bravest European countries when it comes to standing up against Russian authoritarianism and its imperialistic design applied in Ukraine and beyond. It is no coincidence that former Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, a staunch supporter of Ukraine's struggle for self-defense against Russian invasion, has been designated as the new High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. As regards to China, the Baltic countries' posture toward Beijing took a turn when the latter decided not to put any limits on its strategic partnership with Moscow, even if it meant to risk angering economic and commercial partners within the EU. As a consequence of China's agenda in the Russia-Ukraine war, Estonia quit China's 17+1 diplomatic forum, a club aimed at strengthening Beijing's relations with Central and Eastern European countries. While the Estonian government statement did not mention Beijing-Moscow relations, it is clear that it was the main reason behind the decision not to engage with China in a more friendly way. Estonian Prime Minister Kristen Michael's priority is to follow in the footsteps of his predecessor, Kallas, by striving for a pragmatic relationship with China based on pursuing economic gains, as well as on standing up for the respect of human rights and the international rules-based order. Estonia-Taiwan relations should advance on the basis of mutual trust, deeply shared values, and awareness of the challenges stemming from like-minded authoritarian countries. In that sense, Taiwan can help Estonia tackle Russia's hybrid threat tactics by sharing its expertise in dealing with China's digital warfare consisting of cybersecurity threats, information manipulation, and interference activities. As Moscow and Beijing become further aligned in their shared efforts to create a multipolar order, where the existing rules respect is to be questioned, China's economic expansion and malign interference activities should lead to a deeper engagement between Estonia and Taiwan. In particular, as Europe is concerned of China's investments in critical infrastructures, Taiwan should confront the risks of Beijing's economic coercion by exploiting the opportunities stemming from an expanded relationship with like-minded countries such as Taiwan. Regarding Russia's digital warfare, Taipei's model of resilience can prove beneficial in providing a strong expertise for developing strategies adjusted to local specificities. Greater coordination between democratic countries would also act as a countermeasure to authoritarian threats. As regards to unofficial diplomatic relations, in November last year, the Estonian government reviewed its approach to Taiwan to allow the opening of a Taiwanese representative office in Estonia. As it is one of the few Nordic and Baltic countries without Taiwanese representation, the move might be the cornerstone of a new Taiwan policy toward Taipei, with negotiations are ongoing to achieve this purpose. At the beginning of this month, Estonian Riksdagen Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Marko Mihkelson led a delegation of the committee to Taipei. The visit, the first ever in Estonia-Taiwan relations, underscores the closer ties between the two sides. When looking at the relations between Estonia and Taiwan in recent years, it can be seen that cooperation has become considerably close at various levels, Mihkelson said. It is further evidenced by the delegation's meeting with Chinese Nationalist Party Chairman Eric Chu. As Estonia's relationship with Taiwan gradually intensifies, it is important to note the areas of potential collaboration not exploited yet by the two sides. In particular, in addition to the establishment of a Taiwanese representative office in Estonia, the two countries should strengthen their semiconductor partnership to boost production and Taiwan's investments in Europe. Taiwan could provide licenses for semiconductor manufacturing, along with training for Estonian workers. Taking into account the developments regarding Lithuania-Taiwan relations, particularly as regards to their semiconductor partnership, a deeper understanding between parties could be the key to turning point in the relationship. China's refusal to play a role in ending Russia's war in Ukraine made Estonia, as well as other Central and European countries, more aware of the growing political bond between Moscow and Beijing. It is imperative to better understand the nature of the threat they pose together. Allowing Taiwan to be known as the strong ally it represents would help increase Estonian sympathy toward Taipei and solidify the alliance of hope, opposed to the increasingly authoritarian Russian-Chinese front aimed at undermining the international order.
Taiwan beat Cuba after they advanced into Super Round. Taiwan last night defeated Cuba 2-0 in their World Baseball Softball Confederation Premier 12 Group B game at the Taipei Dome and finished the group second. At the Taipei Tianmu Baseball Stadium, South Korea yesterday defeated Australia 5-2, while Japan last night won 11-3 against the Dominican Republic. On Sunday, Taiwan scored 2 three-run homers in an 11-3 blowout win over Australia at the Taipei Dome to advance to the Super Round. Fresh off a defeat at the hands of defending Premier 12 champions and Group B winners Japan the previous day, Taiwan's offense came out slugging against Australia from the off. After taking a walk to first base, Taiwan's Chun Chi-shin stole second before Sang Song-en drew a walk to first in the top of the first inning. Chun then scored on an RBI from Pan Chi-kai to put Taiwan ahead 1-0. Taiwan made it 2-0 in the top of the second after Lee Kai-wei made it home on an RBI from Lin Lee. However, Australia's Solomon Maguire scored the game's first home run with no one on to reduce the deficit to 2-1 in the bottom of the third. Taiwan managed to keep Australia scoreless through the next 4 innings and take a 5-1 lead. In the top of the seventh, Taiwan loaded the first and second bases with Chun Chun-wei and Chong Ching-yu with 1 out. Lin then sent a ball flying for a 3-run homer to bump the score to 8-1 in favor of Taiwan. Taiwan's advantage seemed to fire up Australia as Robbie Perkins sent a 1-run homer over the fence at the bottom of the seventh. In the top of the ninth, Taiwan cranked up the heat to lead 11-2 after pinch hitter Gilja Kung fired a home run to deep left field with 2 men on. With Sunday's win, Taiwan finished second in Group B and secured a place in the Premier 12 Super Round alongside Japan, as well as the top 2 teams from Group A, the US and Venezuela. Taiwan wins over Australia 11-3 in Premier 12. Taiwan scored 2 3-run homers in an 11-3 blowout win over Australia at the Taipei Dome last night to advance to the Super Round of the 2024 World Baseball Softball Confederation Premier 12 tournament. Fresh off a defeat at the hands of defending Premier 12 champion and Group B winner Japan the previous day, Taiwan's offense came out slugging against Australia from the off. After taking a walk to first base, Taiwan's Chen Qixin then stole second before Sang Song-en drew a walk to first in the top of the first inning. Chen then scored on an RBI from Pan Chi-kai to put Taiwan ahead 1-0. Taiwan made it 2-0 in the top of the second after Lee Kai-wei made it home on an RBI from Lin Lee. However, Australia's Solomon Maguire scored the game's first home run with no one on to reduce the deficit to 2-1 in the bottom of the third. Taiwan managed to keep Australia scoreless through the next 4 innings while adding 2 runs at the top of the fourth and 1 at the top of the fifth to take a 5-1 lead going into the seventh. In the top of the seventh, Taiwan loaded the first and second bases with Chun Chun-wei and Chong Qingyu with 1 out. Lin then took the box as Taiwan's 4th batter of the inning, and after enduring 1 foul ball at the hands of Australian pitcher Blake Townsend, sent a ball flying for a 3-run homer to bump the score to 8-1 in favor of Taiwan. Taiwan's advantage seemed to fire up Australia as Robbie Perkins sent a 1-run homer over the fence at the bottom of the 7th. In the top of the 9th, Taiwan cranked up the heat to lead 11-2 after pinch hitter Gilja Kung fired a home run to deep left field with 2 men on. Despite playing its best baseball of the night, occupying third base twice, Australia was only able to pull back a single run in the final inning. With yesterday's win, Taiwan finished second in Group B and secured a place in the Premier 12 Super Round alongside group winners Japan, as well as the top 2 teams from Group A, the United States and Venezuela. Taiwan's best finish at the WBSC Premier 12, which brings together the world's 12 best national teams, was at the second edition of the tournament in 2019, when it finished 5th place.